I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon, and I want to thank you for sticking it out all the way through the day to listen to me. I was, in the break, trying to figure out what the connection is that I'm going to be talking about today with the previous lectures. So given what we've just heard, what's the likelihood you would hear this presentation? And I think what I just said was about the only connection you're going to find between what I'm talking about and what's come before it. I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to be reading this so I kind of stay on target because I know I'm the only thing between you and the reception. So I want to keep things moving along as expeditiously as possible. It will also prevent me from walking around too much. I'm a little bit tethered with this microphone because microphones were not invented for ladies, I suppose, since I don't have pockets or jackets or belts or anything to hook the microphone to. Okay, so I'll be talking about radical embodied cognition, psychological projection, and the hard problem of consciousness. We've known since at least the 1960s that the brain responds more to stimuli it was not expecting. Novel stimuli captures our attention, and this well-known fact forms the basis for several contemporary theories of mind and brain, including those of Andy Clark and Tony Chimero's, their notions of embodied cognition. Clark argues that our brains are fundamentally prediction machines, while Chimero holds that noticing unexpected events is key to understanding the larger cognitive system of which our brains are one part. Both Clark and Chimero also believe that expecting some event to occur in the world is somehow tied to our conscious experiences. Chimero has developed this idea more extensively, and it is his views that I wish to focus upon here. In his book, Radical Embodied Cognition, Chimero, along with Michael Silberstein and other work that they've done, advanced the radical thesis that cognition and consciousness are actually the same thing. He draws this conclusion from his understanding of cognition as a dynamical, nonlinear, and extended process. I question this conclusion. Even if, at bottom, we are the brain-body environmental synergies that Chimero and others claim we are, we will not be able to conclude that consciousness just is cognition, because this view expands cognition beyond being the sort of natural kind upon which to hook phenomenal experience. Let me first outline the bits of Chimero's radical embodied theory of mind-brain relevant to my contention. I'll then show how this view expands cognition, at least as it is understood in any sort of traditional sense, and how, because cognition has been radically inflated, contra Chimero's claim that, this is quoting him, the problem of qualia does not arise in radical embodied cognitive science, embodied cognition does not solve any of the hard problems associated with consciousness. However, I will end on a positive note, which is unusual for a philosopher, suggesting that some of Chimero's views help us to understand some aspects of conscious experience. Most date the recent embodied movement in cognitive science to the early 1990s in the work of Rodney Brooks and Francesco Valera, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Rosh's book, The Embodied Mind, though of course J.J. Gibson's ecological theories are its earliest contemporary incarnation. Their work was intended to be an antidote for computational views of mind in which perception, memory, and thought all become manipulations of brain-based mental representations. Proponents of embodied cognition hold that agents' bodies, and often their local environments, are not only physically relevant to cognition, but are also causally constitutive. Moreover, cognition is not the rational and abstract process that computationalists assume, but is instead dedicated to helping our bodies move and act upon our environment. Meaning, then, is not tied to representational relationships, but is instead a product of the brain-body environment interactions. We have evolved as a species to take advantage of our environment, and we do so as we solve so-called cognitive problems. In many cases, what at first appears to be a difficult problem to solve using abstract representations and computations divorced from the physical world turns out to be much easier to resolve if we are allowed to consider our bodies and our environment as cognitive resources. Chimero points to Esther Thalen and Linda Smith's work in developmental psychology and Edwin Hutchins' work in cognitive anthropology to underscore this idea. It's easy for a human to learn to move about on Earth because Mother Nature designed our legs for walking on earthly terrain. We can learn how to navigate boats in a featureless sea using the stars and a simple sextant. In other words, instead of using our brains to solve problems, we manipulate our bodies and our environments to dissolve them. Moreover, in doing this, we can also alter our bodies and our environments such that the problems we need to solve also change. Gathering food presents a different sort of challenge in a cultivated field compared to an unspoiled savanna rich with bison. Hence, instead of thinking of the agent and its environment as two separate systems that occasionally touch each other, it's better to see them as a single entity in a continuous flux. It follows relatively unproblematically from this perspective that cognition is extended into the environment. It also follows relatively unproblematically from this perspective that dynamical systems theory would be the appropriate mathematical tool by which to model these complex interactions. Any mathematical model of this larger system should describe how it unfolds dynamically over time. And it takes a set of nonlinear differential equations to do this. What makes Chimero's views of embodied cognition radical is that he claims that dynamical systems theory, which we need in order to be able to model cognition, does not presuppose mental representations, or indeed any representations at all. If brains, bodies, and environment form one unified system, then there is no need for one part of the system to represent another part of the system, for everything is always and already connected. Perception, action, and thought itself are all non-representational and non-computational. Okay, so let's accept this view as true and see how we might explain consciousness using this understanding of human cognition and action. Silberstein and Chimero in 2012 wrote a paper in which they said that conscious experience is, quote, an essential feature of an extended brain-body environment system, and that phenomenology and cognition are inseparable. Why do they believe this? A feature of nonlinear systems is that they are not decomposable into individual component parts. Thus, if brain, body, and environment are coupled nonlinearly, then we cannot break this larger system down into its component pieces either. We have one brain-body environment system that is continuously evolving and changing over time. If this is the case, as we're presuming it is, and if this system is conscious, as we presume we are, then it follows that consciousness is extended into the environment just as cognition is. Consciousness becomes an intrinsic element of the larger system. Really, what Silberstein and Chimero want to conclude is that consciousness and cognition are inseparable and complementary aspects of a coupled brain-body environmental system. Again, quoting them, experience is cognition, and cognition is experiential. They co-determine each other. Computational theories of mind artificially create the problem of consciousness, for they give the impression that one can have mental computation without concomitant conscious thought. We get the problem of consciousness because we can imagine non-human, apparently unconscious machines or zombies instantiating a computational theory of mind. That is, we can imagine cognition without consciousness, or so we think. This is the hard problem of consciousness, a challenge that dates back to at least Gottfried Leibniz in 1714. Because we can imagine a something that is identical to a human or a brain's physical interactions without also imagining the thing's consciousness, it appears that nothing about physical interaction should give rise to phenomenal experiences. And yet, we are conscious, nonetheless. How can this be? Leibniz's answer, like David Chalmers' more contemporary one, is to posit that consciousness is a fundamental part of the ontology of our universe. But if computational minds are false, then this problem of consciousness does not arise. Cognition is a feature of our extended and embodied system, as is consciousness. By refusing to separate meaningful cognition and phenomenology, Sebastien and Chimero just eliminate the so-called hard problem of consciousness by definitional fiat. Can they do this? To answer this question, we need a more complete picture of what they are envisioning an extended phenomenological cognitive system to be. Our nervous system has its own spontaneous and internally generated dynamics, which in turn create transient neural assemblies that comprise our sensory motor capabilities. We are coupled to our environment via these sensory motor structures, which result in changes to both our internal transient neural assemblies via sensory feedback and in the external environment via behavioral responses. Over time, we become attuned to the nuances in the extended brain-body environment system that complements our sensory motor sensitivities and external features. This is our niche. When we perceive in our environment via our sensory motor structures and probably other related neural assemblies, what we perceive are nothing less than Gibsonian affordances, relational features of the brain-body environment system used to guide our actions and behavior. They are constrained both by what the environment contains and by what we can do. Sebastien and Chimero claim that the set of affordances we perceive in our world just is the environment as we experience it. Consciousness, like cognition, this is my graphic for consciousness, by the way, then just as the ongoing activity of a nervous system, body, and environmental niche nonlinearly coupled to one another. Just as our neural assemblies are not anatomically hardwired, they are softly assembled, so too are the borders of the brain-body environment system. How far and how much we extend into the environment depend a great deal on what we're trying to do and what barriers or assistance the environment provides to us. The entire system itself, then, is a soft assembly whose interaction dynamics determine its structure. Some call such interaction-dominant, softly assembled systems synergies. As the dean, I used to call a synergy something else, but it's okay. A synergy is a set of structural units that temporarily link together to form a single cohesive functional system. It's maintained or changed on the fly as its dynamics and processes ebb and flow over time. We know that we have a synergy when we can measure pink noise associated with it. Pink noise, or 1/f noise, refers to a signal in which the power spectrum density, or the energy per hertz, is inversely proportional to the frequency. It's called pink noise because visible light with this power spectrum looks pink. We can contrast pink noise with white noise, which has equal energy on every frequency. The static we sometimes hear on the radio can be white noise, and pink noise instead has an equal energy per octave. To our ears, auditory pink noise sounds much more natural and less jarring than white noise. Pink noise is also a hallmark of fractal timing and appears to be ubiquitous in nature, occurring in everything from cosmic background radiation to flooding patterns of the Nile River. It's an indication of nested self-similar structures that occur over time. Guy Van Orden and his colleagues argue that pink noise signifies just the sort of interaction-dominant, softly assembled system we've been discussing as a model for cognition. And with this technical idea in hand, scientists are now able to manipulate and measure our dynamic embodiment experimentally. For example, Chimero and his colleagues devised an experiment that forces change in our extended cognitive synergy. Undergraduates engage in a simple video game using a computer monitor and a mouse. At irregular intervals during each trial, the connection between the mouse and the monitor was disrupted. Interestingly, pink noise is present at the hand-mouse interface until the disruption. And once the disruption is over and the connection returns to normal, the pink noise returns. These measures index changes in the boundary of the extended cognitive synergy. During the normal phase of the task, the mouse is part of the system. During disruption, it's not. Most important for our purposes, the measures of pink noise correlates with our conscious experiences. When we are engaged in the video game, we are not aware of the hand-mouse interface per se. But once the connection between mouse and monitor is altered, then the mouse grabs our attention and we become aware of it. This sort of mental projection has been known and studied for a long time by psychologists who use it to explain everything from road rage, because drivers sort of literally become one with their cars, to penmanship. The point is, we project ourselves into our environment, and in doing so, we experience the edges of our extended system. We have long known that this is the case, but it's only now that psychologists have been able to develop metrics for measuring changes in our projections. The pink noise of our cognitive synergy indexes our phenomenal experience. I think that this is the best argument for why the picture Chimero paints might in fact be true. We notice and pay attention to, experience, things that do not match our predictions or expectations. And we experience these things in terms of what we could do or how we could act. Our experiences are about or of the relationship we have with the world, which is continuously changing and evolving. These mixes of brain, body, and environment are what Gibson called objective-subjective hybrids. And that fact, Chimero believes, solves the problem of consciousness. For this is how subjectivity exists in the objective world. It exists in the ongoing relationship between an agent and the context of its actions. As Chimero remarks, conscious experiences are what happens when animals pick up information about affordances. I'm going to leave aside the question of whether affordances are actually part of the extended phenomenal cognitive synergy. Silberstein and Chimero seem to think they are. According to them, affordances are what we perceive. Our behavioral niche, the set of affordances we have learned to perceive and act upon, just is the environment as we experience it. If this were the case, though, then we would not experience affordances as asserted, because we see through our system to disturbances and possibilities beyond. Okay, so what's wrong with this story? I think there are two things, though these two things are really demonstrations of the same fact, namely that the sort of non-linear coupling that links us with our environment is found at all sorts of levels of organization. Without further analysis, we cannot identify which level corresponds to cognition. Hence, tying consciousness to cognition either means consciousness exists at multiple levels of organization, which strikes most people as improbable, or more work needs to be done to delineate conscious cognition from other synergies. And if we need to do more work, then the problem of consciousness remains to be solved. I've already mentioned that we find synergies everywhere in nature. Importantly, we find them within the brain itself. We can also find them across groups of humans acting in concert. Some take this latter type of evidence to show that cognition can be extended across individuals. But in both cases, though, we find softly assembled, interaction-dominant, nonlinear, dynamical systems whose behavior strongly resembles prototypical cognition, perception, and action. So, for example, we can go small with our cognitive synergies. Neuroscientists are now capable of recording responses from thousands of neurons simultaneously, as we heard about earlier. It's becoming clear that neural correlates for things like memory and decision-making are at the population level. The firing rates of individual neurons can change over time, even though the stimulus input remains constant. Modeling studies show that while individual neurons might appear disordered and uncoordinated, the population level is not. We know that neurons and neural circuits have to respond quickly and flexibly as contexts change. This means they need to be able to ignore irrelevant information while reacting to whatever is important to the larger task at hand. So, for example, neural responses in the frontal eye fields in monkeys were recorded as they performed a visual discrimination task using noisy stimuli. It turns out that the individual neurons each respond to the motion and color of stimuli, the context, as well as the target itself. While these signals co-occur on the individual level, they are separable at the population level through linear regression. Importantly, stimuli analysis at the population level is integrated with motor choices, just as the proponents of embodied cognition would have predicted. And we see similar dynamics in the olfactory system of the fly as well. One important facet of nonlinear dynamical systems is that they are nested systems, and their components exhibit the same sort of dynamics as the system as a whole. Individual neurons and ion channels in neurons also appear to have the same dynamical pink noise properties as the activity of populations of neurons. While most are comfortable believing that monkeys are conscious, it's less clear that we want to assert that flies are. And it's probably even more problematic to assert that parts of monkey brains or fly brains are conscious. Chimero could probably wriggle out of this problem with his definition of cognition. He defines cognition as the ongoing active maintenance of a robust animal environment system achieved by closely coordinated perception and action. In other words, the sorts of synergies I've been discussing are necessary but not sufficient for cognition. He could restrict consciousness to the brain-body environment systems level, or even to the animal brain-body environment system. If you move inside the head, there might exist dynamical systems modeled in identical ways to the animal brain-body world synergy, but there would be no actual cognition. And no cognition would mean no consciousness as well, according to Chimero's views. Of course, this move does not solve the hard problem of consciousness, and that's what this graphic is. This is the hard problem of consciousness. Since it does not explain what might be special about the animal brain-body environment synergy such that it has consciousness, but the olfactory system of the fly brain does not. Indeed, this move echoes the challenge before the computationalist. What is it that's special about human or primate or animal or whatever is conscious computations that make them conscious? Prima facie, there's nothing about the computations themselves that should give rise to conscious experience, and there are certainly many computational systems that we believe are not conscious. Similarly, we can ask, what is it that's special about an animal brain-body environmental interaction that's cognitive and therefore conscious? Prima facie, there's nothing about being an animal synergy that should give rise to conscious experience. In particular, there does not seem to be anything special about an animal brain-body environmental interaction that an animal brain body-piece environment interaction would also not share. Of course, another alternative is that Chimero could bite the bullet here and conclude that fly pieces are indeed conscious in their own sort of flyish way. Being an interaction-dominant, softly assembled pink noise sort of synergy is both necessary and sufficient for cognition, and therefore for consciousness as well. The right sort of dynamics is all you need for cognition. The nested components of the nonlinear systems have all the same properties as the mother system, and this would include cogitating and consciousness. So much the worse for some folks' intuitions. Now, let's consider going large in our analysis. Steve Harrison and Michael Richardson have show that naive subjects, when paired together, spontaneously become synced. In their study, subjects were told to walk or jog, one behind the other, when they were joined end to end by a foam bar about 2.5 feet long. It's not too surprising that their leg movements became spontaneously entrained with one another. But what was surprising was that the pairs spontaneously trotted, an anti-phase coordination, or walked, an in-phase coordination, depending on which gait was the more stable. None of the participants were aware of how each was coordinated with the other. These patterns emerged on their own from the physical constraints of the component pieces of the system. Lest you believe that genuine cognition, and not just kind of mimicking a horse, might require something else or something more, Mike Roberts and Robert Goldstern have shown that groups of individuals, without communicating with one another, can spontaneously coordinate their roles within the group to achieve their goal. Roberts and Goldstone recruited teams of undergraduates who were connected to each other via the internet to play a game in which they were collectively to guess a randomly generated number. Each member of the group typed a number between 0 and 50. The numbers were then summed, and the group as a whole was told whether that sum was greater or less than the target. Over time, the groups were able to guess the targets with fewer and fewer rounds. What's interesting is that the individual members of the group took up different roles in the game, some reacting to the feedback and others not, such that these roles remained consistent across rounds and aided in uncovering the solution. In other words, the success of this cognitive task was not due to the actions of any individual member. Rather, it emerged from the group as a whole as its component pieces learned to behave in particular ways. We could say that the system as a whole exhibited cognition. At least it seems to by the intuitive definitions of the term. Is this system thereby conscious as well? The answer, of course, hangs on how Chimero defines cognition. If we were to take his definition strictly, then these interactions would not count as cognition because they are greater than an animal-environment interaction. Yet surely this looks like cognition. As a group, the subjects are solving a complex problem in a non-random fashion. Now Chimero needs to explain why his definition of cognition is preferable to the standard perspectives, and he needs to do so in a non-question begging way. So far as I know, he has not done this in his writings, and since his office is actually right next to mine, I'm pretty sure I'm right on this one. And indeed, since he denies that the proponents of radical embodied cognitive science actually require a definition of cognition, because he doesn't really think it exists, one should not expect him to. But he does indicate that he takes his understanding of cognition to reflect claims by radical embodied cognitive science in philosophy, psychology, and artificial life. Hence, insofar as the radical embodied cognitive scientists believe that Roberts and Goldstone's work illustrates cognition on a macro level, then his articulation of the nature of cognition aside, Chimero should as well. Of course, it would be fair for Chimero to respond that I, as an animal brain body environment synergy, have my consciousness, and then my gaming group has its own minimal sort of transient consciousness, and I simply don't have access to that other consciousness any more than I have access to the consciousness of anyone or anything else. Perhaps, though, he would not want to do this, since as Sebastien and he point out, one advantage of tying consciousness to cognition is to eliminate fruitless philosophical discussions of qualia and the so-called hard problem of consciousness. They want to get rid of the challenge of envisioning odd machines as being conscious because they are computing over representations by denying that conscious systems compute at all. But here we are, back discussing an odd machine and whether it has experiences. This time, however, we're also wondering whether the system is cognitive at all. I'm sure by now you can see where I'm going. The complaints similar to the one Chimero and Sebastien lodge against traditional consciousness studies, that defining cognition as representation manipulation and then differentiating it from consciousness is what artificially creates the hard problem in consciousness studies, can also be lodged against them. While we can define cognition as a particular type of synergy, and we can believe that cognition is just an extended, softly assembled animal brain body environment synergy, and we can deny that manipulating representations has anything to do with humans thinking, we still do not escape the fundamental problem with explaining consciousness. That is, explaining why anything is conscious. Lots of entities in the environment have the properties that Chimero wants to tie to cognition. Some or all of these entities cogitate, but it presents quite a leap to assume that they are all conscious as well. More work needs to be done to isolate what it is about synergies, even particular types of synergies, that makes them conscious. It cannot be just cognition, as we find at least some versions of cognition and synergies that are not obviously conscious. We are still lacking the correlate of consciousness. I conclude, Chimero cannot just tie consciousness to cognition, even radical embodied cognition, and thereby do away with the hard problem. Even if the thesis of radical embodied cognition were true, we still don't know how to understand consciousness. However, I'm not sure we should go down the path of saddling Chimero with the hard problem of consciousness just yet. For there's at least one important difference between the brain-body environment synergies and the human coupling I just described that might give us a wee bit of insight into conditions for conscious awareness. And that is, we do not or cannot project ourselves psychologically onto or through other individuals. Unlike driving a car, in which we can feel the tires on the road, when coupled with another person, we don't feel the other person's feet hitting the ground. Whatever sort of system or synergy coupled humans are, the psychological reality of having an animate object in the environment is quite different from having an inanimate object. Inanimate object environment synergies are transparent to us. Human couplings are not. There has to be something fundamentally different between the two. What is it? I shall argue that the difference lies in how we perceive the respective affordances. And insofar as how we perceive affordances is tied to how we consciously experience the world, then it could be that Chimero is onto something after all. There are some odd cases of associative agnosia in which patients are unable to recognize or name living things like lions or possums, but they can recognize and name inanimate objects like forks and radios without a problem. If we take a traditional neuroreductionist point of view, then we should conclude that information about living things are stored in a different place in the brain than information about inanimate objects. And so damage to the living thing place in our brain results in patients with deficits in recognizing living things, and damage to the inanimate object place would result in patients with deficits in recognizing inanimate objects. But interestingly, and perhaps counterintuitively, there are very few cases in which a patient cannot recognize inanimate objects, but can recognize living things. We don't get the neat double dissociation that neuropsychologists crave. If there are two separate areas for living and inanimate objects, then why would we find brain damage possible in one area but not the other? Antonio Damasio suggests that this pattern could be due to a difference in how we perceive living and inanimate objects. In particular, we manipulate inanimate objects, but for the most part, we don't living ones. We interact physically with forks and radios, but not so much with lions and possums. As a result, we would be activating a greater number of brain regions when we perceive inanimate objects than when we do living things. In both cases, we activate areas associated with visual perception. But in the case of seeing a tool in our environment, we also activate kinesthetic and motor movement brain regions, and imaging study seems to bear out this conjecture. Hence, it might be the case that we do not have different brain areas that respond differentially to living versus non-living objects, but rather we just have more regions involved with one type of perception over another. With more regions activated in response to inanimate objects, and therefore more regions that would have to be damaged in order to see the related agnosia, it would not be surprising that we have a hard time finding patients with deficits naming inanimate objects but not living things. Scientists have also found that biological motion stimulates regions of the brain in different ways from non-biological motion, particularly in the amygdala, which is connected to our emotional reactions. From an evolutionary perspective, perhaps this makes good sense because we need to be able to distinguish our conspecifics and predators from other things as early and as quickly as possible, as well as each from the other. Infants preferentially attend to biological motion over other types of movement extremely early in life, which suggests that this difference in processing potential conspecifics from others is innate. The differences in the ways our brains distinguish different types of objects around us appear to be central to how we respond to the world. So here then is the hypothesis. We distinguish objects in our environment based on how we potentially interact with them. We perceive living things by their visual features and concomitant affective responses, but inanimate objects based on functional properties. This, of course, is just another way to look at affordances. We see and understand the objects around us in terms of how we relate to them and they to us. But now we can go further. Not only are perceptual differences tied to differences in psychological projection between animate and inanimate objects, but also to action decisions and to consciousness itself. I am claiming that we do not project ourselves through what we perceive to be other living things in our environment. We can only project ourselves through objects that we manipulate functionally. I confess I'm doing this without terribly good data to back up my assertion. I also note that there might be good exceptions to this general rule. For example, when we use a living thing as a tool in our environment. I could believe, for example, that a practiced person might project through a trained seeing eye dog to the environment beyond. I've been trying to investigate how it feels to ride a horse, but so far I've gotten inconsistent responses. We can only extend our conscious experience into whatever psychological space of projection we have available to us. One limit on our conscious experience is not just the edge of the affordance, so to speak, but it's also the type of affordance we perceive. Functional objects become psychologically transparent to us, such that we project our conscious experience through them. Animate objects do not. This suggestion dovetails with data we have concerning the neural correlates of consciousness and action. While we might assume that we become consciously aware of our actions as information about our peripheral movements travels to our brains, or as we're making decisions about what type of behaviors to pursue, neither seems to be the case. Our conscious experiences of action are independent of the physical movements themselves and of our cognitive control mechanisms. Indeed, we become aware of intentions to move just slightly in advance of the movements themselves, and these experiences appear to double as our experience of the movement itself. Increased activity in the posterior parietal cortex, which is tied to movement intention and action selection, indexes our experiences of motor execution in the environment. When surgeons gently stimulate Brodmann's areas 39 and 40, which are part of the parietal cortex, in awake and alert patients undergoing brain surgery, the patients report experiencing intentions to move, as well as illusory movements themselves. When the electrical stimulation increases, patients believe they actually had moved, even though there was no electromyographic activity. In contrast, when surgeons stimulate the premotor area, patients really do move, but they have no conscious awareness of the action. Desmergent concludes that intentions and the prediction of what will result from carrying out these intentions create our conscious experience that we're moving. The parietal cortex prepares for movement and defines our conscious experience of action, and the motor areas of the brain actually elicit the action. One way to understand this description is that we become aware of affordances as we prepare to take advantage of them in reaching our specific goals in action. I don't mean to suggest by this claim that we can now just reduce our conscious experiences to environmental affordances, to activity patterns in parietal cortex. More is involved than that. These activity patterns are part of a larger perception-action circuit which compose the brain part of the brain-body environment synergy involved in action and behavior. This circuit is part of the brain that recognizes and appreciates the affordances in its environment. However, the activity patterns of the parietal cortex are the ones that seem to be co-generated with our conscious experiences, which strongly suggests that they're related to one another. We know that these perception action circuits loop through at least the frontal cortex, the parietal regions, and supplementary motor cortex, and the visual and other perceptual areas. Cognitive control, hold on. Yep, okay. Cognitive control, goal setting, and behavioral monitoring reside in the frontal cortex, and traditional views have held that consciousness occurs with cognitive control and is connected to our most sophisticated decision making. But recent imaging data suggests that our frontal areas, unlike our parietal regions, are activated during unconsciously primed cognitive control processes. So in an event-related fMRI task, participants were asked to respond as quickly as possible to a target arrow presented immediately after a subliminal masked priming arrow. The prime and the target could be compatible with each other, which is to say the prime and the target would be pointing in the same direction. Incompatible, when the prime and the target would be pointing in opposite directions, or neutral, and the prime points in a direction that's neutral to the target's arrow's direction. Behaviorally, in these sorts of experimental protocols, the incompatible conditions give rise to longer reaction times as compared to the compatible or neutral ones. The longer reaction times for the incompatible conditions are also associated with stronger activity responses in frontal cortex, especially in the anterior cingulate cortex and the right frontal associative areas. In contrast, a facilitated motor response, as demonstrated by the shorter reaction times in the compatible trials, is associated with reduced activity in the medial and lateral premotor cortices, presumably due to repetition suppression effects. Results such as these suggest that these areas are involved in cognitive control and are activated outside of awareness during unconscious visuomotor priming. Instead of conscious awareness being synonymous with our planning and goal setting, it seems to co-occur with intentions to move with a purpose, a step down in the cognitive hierarchy, as it were. And this step down defines, and it is this step down that defines our affordances. I conclude that Tony cannot escape the hard problem of consciousness. Nevertheless, there's something right about his position. Consciousness is connected to, or indexed by, or co-occurs with, or is identical to our perception of affordances, which is intimately tied to how we interact with objects in our environment. We are aware of what we intend to manipulate in our environment in order to achieve our behavioral goals. Consciousness is not identical to all cognition. It's not even identical to all brain-based cognition. Instead, it's deeply linked to one very important part of our cognitive process, perceiving affordances just prior to action. So thank you.
Questions? So, as you were talking, I'm not sure exactly how this relates to what your view is necessarily, but you were talking about Churchland a lot, and the one thing that I find really sort of counterintuitive is that, I mean, you were sort of espousing this at the end, like the part that you thought was appropriate about what he was saying, is that there is something about consciousness and the link to the environment, so it's this embedded, embodied interactivity kind of thing.
Right.
But then if you actually look at the strength of the coupling, comparing like higher order animals to lower order animals, I would suggest that you probably find stronger couplings for animals that are less likely to think are very conscious. So things like flies, right? They're highly coupled to their environment because they have these like super tight reaction times, and the processing going on is, you know, sort of has very low latency, so they're very highly coupled in a sense, right? If you look at humans, which we often think of as having much more sophisticated consciousness, this might be more about order than phenomenology, but like higher order conscious experience, you know, thoughts about yourself and so on, they tend to be very slow, right? So, you know, it takes hundreds of milliseconds for people to actually get information through their system. So like in a way, this almost points in the opposite direction to coupling being the kind of thing you want to look to for picking out an index of consciousness. So, like, how would that
Right.
fit in or relate to the contrary claim as you're sort of suggesting?
Yeah, so I think what Tony would say would be, if you're going to take my view seriously, then all you have done is argue that flies and things like that are actually hyperconscious or more conscious than we are, right? Because he doesn't. We like to think, I don't know where I am, so I'm just going to point to you. You like to think maybe that consciousness is somehow tied to this higher order stuff. And his view is, no, that you're looking in the wrong space for it. And I think my view is similar to that in that a lot of the higher order thought that we think is conscious, I think is actually not conscious. And what we're conscious of is much more of either our embodied activities or our thinking about our embodied activities in one way or another. I mean, we're not conscious of pure thought, right?
No, but it seems to me the fact, like, our ability to reflect on our actions is improved by the fact that it's more decoupled from the actions, right? So I mean, it's fine for him to tell me that flies are more conscious than I am.
Right.
But that strikes me as incredibly non-intuitive. Like, you need an
Yeah.
extremely strong theory in order to.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I do agree. Yeah. Yep.
Thanks, Valerie. I'm really curious about differences among bodies, among human bodies, and in terms of what affordances we have in the world. So if I have, and especially with respect to disability studies, for example, and how that might, and I'm just curious if you could hypothesize or reflect on the idea that in fact different human bodies face incredibly different kinds of problems, different kinds of affordances with respect to physically the same kinds of environments. And again, my intuition there is that I wouldn't want to say that there's differences in consciousness there, even though, for example, for me a doorknob it gives me a chance to think about twisting, whereas if I didn't have use of my hands, it wouldn't afford that to me at all. And I
Right.
never have had that experience. I'm just curious how that might fit.
Right. So the only studies that I am aware of really have to do with visual impairment and using either a cane to help you through space, or in the lab they also have this backpack that people put on that give vibration symbols relative to their environment. And the task that they were measuring was they were given different openings and they had to position their body so that they could fit through the opening. So if you don't have any sort of visual impairment or you're not blindfolded, then you use your visual information to go through. Now, what's interesting about people who use canes, whether you're visually impaired or you're blindfolded, after you practice a bit, you project yourself through the cane. And so in that sense, your conscious experience, they would say, is actually quite different. And it's not just that now you can't visually see, but rather your sense of bodily space is actually quite different because it's you plus the cane as opposed to just your body. And similarly with the backpack, and the reason they do that is because it's bulky, and so now you have to not only compensate for what you think the size of your body is, but now your new extended body, and people do that quite easily. And so what they want to say is, yes, actually, if you are impaired in one way or another, or differently abled, then your conscious experience actually is probably radically different than somebody without that type of impairment. But that's the only study that I know well enough to be able to speak with a modicum of authority on what's going on.
I had a question, so I hope it's related. There was a talk a few weeks ago or something here by Adrian Owens, who's doing this work with people who are in
Coma?
sort of
Yeah.
presumably coma,
Mm-hmm.
but they're able to sort of communicate with them by having them sort of imagine performing, playing tennis or navigating around a house. And in that case, those individuals are having no discernible interaction with an external environment. There may be some sleep-wake cycles. How does your approach or the approach you're critiquing sort of speak to their circumstances and what we would think or might think about their conscious experience?
Right. So I think somebody like Tony Chimero would say that insofar as these responses are legitimate, then they probably are having some conscious experience because it is a simulation of movement through their environment, which he takes to be kind of the prototypical consciousness type experience. I've never actually asked him that question. I always have a real challenge with Adrian Owen's work in concluding that these people are conscious because, truth be told, right, I've just given you this whole speculative story about consciousness. We have no idea what it is, none whatsoever, right? And every 10 minutes, somebody's coming out with a new theory, and we were just talking about this, proposing it's everything from microtubules to information integration, and now Christoph Koch thinks everything in the universe is conscious. It just gets weirder and weirder. So the idea that we know what it is well enough to be able to say, well, these severely brain damaged people are conscious because they can, the brain reacts to a vocal command, I think is quite a huge leap. Certainly we can argue that there's some language comprehension going on, absolutely, and they have some sort of cognitive facilities left, but do we actually want to align this with consciousness? I think until we actually have a good theory of consciousness, that's a huge, huge stretch.